All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Conscious Mental Health Podcast. I am Laurel, content developer with the Academy of Integrative Mental Health. And our guest today is Masha Shapiro. Masha is a licensed mental health counselor in New York, and she has over 14 years of combined clinical experience in the field. She owns a private practice known as Doors to Freedom Mental Health Counseling Services, as well as a group practice, We Rise Mental Health Counseling Services. Masha graduated from Fordham University with a degree in mental health counseling in 2013 and is currently pursuing her PhD in marriage and family therapy. Masha is a triple certified trauma professional and is a certified individual trauma specialist, a complex trauma specialist, and is fully certified in EMDR through EMDR. Masha also specializes in the treatment of anxiety, panic disorder, OCD, perinatal mood disorders, narcissistic abuse recovery, self-esteem, and relationship issues. And I am so excited, Masha, to get to talk today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Laurel. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you so much for that beautiful introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm ready to get into our conversation. So I'm curious, just to get us started off, can you share some about your background with our listeners, how maybe that's impacted your path to this work that you're doing now, and what drew you to the work that you're doing now?
Totally. So I will say I was no stranger to trauma since the time that I was 8. I lost my father, and then I had a series of other traumatic events, including car accidents and other family losses. So trauma has been something that's been very much a part of my life. And about 5 years ago, I gave birth to my daughter. At that time, I experienced a trauma so severe that it gave a new name to what trauma was for me. And it was pretty significant PTSD. And I was married to somebody that was quite unsupportive, which really complicated my recovery process. And it really wasn't until our divorce that I was able to kind of spin my life around and make meaning from the suffering that I endured. And I decided at that point to go get certified in to be an individual trauma professional. I think that's what the certification is, and a complex trauma professional, and then ultimately get certified in EMDR, which I found so many women are in similar positions and can relate to what I was going through. And my main message to them is just sometimes trauma changes us fundamentally. You can look back and you don't even recognize who you are. And sometimes in a really positive, uplifting way. And I really compare it a lot to Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And and here he was, this guy in the Holocaust, and he made meaning from his suffering. And I wouldn't change a single part of anything I went through. And I want that message to empower anyone who's been through anything traumatic.
Yeah.
About me, and now that's how I got into trauma. Now, as you mentioned, I have a private practice, and we recently expanded into a group practice last year, and we're all pretty trauma informed. That's a integral part of the practice. We love it. We love, being able to be there and be that support.
Yeah. Oh, and I think it's so interesting, just the way that life converges around different things, and how our story kind of, especially as helping professionals, as mental health professionals, like brings us into this work. Because I talk a lot of times with my clients about how, it's impossible for me to not be a human and be present, in this space with you, not just as a therapist, but as a human. Right. And so it's just like unavoidable that my story would not be part of my work. And so I think just hearing about your story and how that's brought you to that work, that has to empower your clients. Like, I don't think it couldn't, to kind of connect, even if they don't know all the details, like just to connect with someone who can have that personal experience of, no, I'm not just, cognitively and academically aware of these things, but like I have this bodily, this life, this narrative experience of what you're going through.
And as a therapist, there's always a fine line between self-disclosure, but I found use appropriate with clients, like, really, you went through that and you were able to survive the effects of something like that, then I can too. And it really, I guess, provides a sense of universality to them, which can promote healing.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's just so like healing just to hear that sort of, just to look across the room or next to you and hear that sort of like me too. I think that's incredibly healing. And there are lots of different modalities that we use in therapy and theories and all of this, but ultimately that relational part is such a huge piece of the puzzle. So thank you for sharing that part of your story, you know. Yeah. And so tell me a little bit, because I know that you are in PhD candidacy, right? Tell me a little bit about that part of this, like the research that you're looking into, because that relates to all of this work that you're doing clinically as well, right? Talk to me a little bit about that and tell our listeners a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So, of course, definitely looking at trauma research. And, during my trainings in the course of everything I found in the literature, something that's really interesting and I find kind of fascinating is there is something that's called a prodromal period to PTSD. And researchers have found that there are ways to identify that PTSD is going to occur because every single one of us have PTS, right? And post-traumatic stress. And that a great example of that can be seen when we're walking down the street at night and we're clutching our bag or we're looking behind our shoulder because we've been trained to be afraid. The news, various media outlets, right? But I was always kind of drawn to what makes somebody go on to develop PTSD versus just a traumatic response or no trauma. And researchers found that there is an actual change in your physical orientation, so time either slowing up or, excuse me, speeding up or slowing down can completely disorient your experience and is one of the strongest markers to suggest that someone may develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So I find that fascinating and I wanted to explore that more, and do studies with people who have, previously been traumatized and if that has been a factor.
Yeah. That is fascinating. I mean, truly, even as, a person who I do a lot of trauma work in my own clinical practice and, who takes trainings and I try to keep up to date on the research on my end and through the academy as well with the training work that we do. I think talking to you, this is the first time truly that I've ever heard about this phenomena. Like that is just incredible to me that we've been able to narrow it down or are working on narrowing it down that specifically to kind of have these markers. I mean, what a I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking even out loud now as I'm processing and talking, like what a changing factor that could be for so many people,
Mhm.
right? To identify, okay, if there's these specific components that can lead to PTS turning into PTSD, what do we do with that? There's probably a million things we could do with that, but just like knowing, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
When I look at my own trauma or I speak to my clients and I kind of ask them, have you experienced a change in perception or orientation? And a lot of them say yes. And those are the ones that actually do have PTSD or see PTSD. They've
Mhm.
had that happen at least once.
Mhm. So how did this prodromal period come up? Like how did this start being discovered? Like what's the background on how that came about even into our awareness?
Sure. I think researchers, for years and decades have been trying to figure out, like, hey, what is going on that is causing, you could have 10 people in a room, two of them will have severe PTSD and the other ones won't have PTSD. What is the cause? Is it genetics? Is it environmental? Right. And I think some of those questions will never fully be answered, but I think they're starting to understand more and more about certain things that precipitate this. Right. And I think this is going to be something that's going to be research way after we're here, and it's going to be a continued period of research. It's one of the most fascinating topics, really. Like, even in my personal life, I've seen people lose people, loved ones, right in front of their eyes, and they didn't get traumatized. But then you would sneeze at me, and I'd get traumatized, right? And
Right.
people
Yeah.
say And sometimes, a lot of clients are like, trauma is, it could only be something like a disaster, like an accident or something like that. And that's really not what it is. Trauma can be anything that gives you that reaction. I mean, you can drop water on you the wrong way and that could cause you to feel traumatized, right? And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand about trauma. And there's so much guilt associated with it. People come to me and be like, I don't really have a right to feel this way because I mean, nothing that serious happened. It's not like I was assaulted or do you find that happening?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like I have that conversation with folks all the time, and I find myself, you know, I think it's important to slow down and have that conversation and not just gloss over it, because there is that shame component of, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way about this fill in the blank event or series of events, right? And so it has to be incredibly validating, even um, in the office when you're talking with them about this very fact. I think some people kind of have that conversation and they're like, oh, okay, I hear you. But some people really need these factual pieces of information. And so hearing about that prodromal actually phenomenon in the brain with our perception changing and shifting would probably be incredibly validating.
Absolutely. And that's where the support piece comes in that I was talking about before, because a lot of these clients don't even feel like they have the right, or they feel embarrassed, or they feel guilty, right? And if the appropriate supports aren't in place to piggyback on the idea of expanding the research, then that can complicate recovery.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because you have to be aware and at a place where you're working on recovery from this thing. If you haven't allowed yourself permission to have the experience that you've had and be having the experiences that you are having as a result, then how do you recover from that? So yeah. Mhm. Mhm. And that is just, it is really fascinating. I think you're right, like, for sure we're gonna never know all of the pieces of, because that's part of the mystery of being human. I think there's always going to be an element of mystery to humanity, and then we'll be studying all of this for years and years. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that, like, we know less about the human brain than we know about the deep, deep ocean, which is just like mind blowing to me, that our brains can contain so much mystery and so much complexity. And so, I'm sure we will be studying it for years. But, like, for you, as you think about this idea and sort of how it integrates into all of the components of trauma treatment, through like the support piece, the validation piece, and then moving on to working through the healing process, um, where do you see this sort of taking that field? Like, where do you see the field of trauma work going? Because I feel like sometimes we're on the cusp of something, and that feels exciting to me, but it also kind of makes me a little nervous. Like, I want to be doing, the right thing by my clients, and be supportive in the ways that we know are going to work, even if we don't get it perfectly all the time. So yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I would say that I think as therapists, we take a a lot of responsibility on our backs, and we want to like kind of almost fix that, not even fix, but like, let's make sure we do everything perfectly. And sometimes the only thing that we could do that we can be sure of, because there's so many different approaches to trauma that are clinically studied. We have EMDR, right? We have NLP techniques. We have all of these kind of different factors. And the only thing that we can be sure of, and one of the most healing things in trauma, is a supportive therapist that can provide you with co-regulation, right?
Oh,
I think
absolutely.
so. Anytime you doubt yourself or any therapist doubts themselves, I always say that sometimes people are lacking just basic support. And that's the very least that we can show up and bring to our clients every single day.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because it's true. I mean, and I go back to that in my own mind a lot too, of, if I can be present and take care of myself, and then bring the care that I give to myself regulated in my body into that therapy space, then that is healing, right? And our bodies know how to heal themselves. Our brains have the tools to work on healing themselves if they're given the right support in the right environment. So I am really glad you said that, because I think that co-regulation is incredibly important. And I also think that co-regulation aspect has to do with this idea of change in perception. There has to be something there, right? Because, and you would certainly like know more about this than I would, but just as I'm like thinking on it, um, there seems like there would be this idea of maybe that change in perception has to do with being dysregulated somehow, right? Because you're not orient, or your brain is having a difficulty being oriented and being in that like that nervous system state where we feel safe. You know,
Exactly.
I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that?
I agree. I completely agree. And I think there's this whole other kind of branch of trauma when we look at the mind-body connection, right? We look at animals, they don't get traumatized, right? And the research done by Peter Levine, he found that animals, will get attacked and they just have this like kind of shake off response. Humans, when we get traumatized, right, there is this kind of change in orientation and perception. Trauma is kind of a freeze response, right? So the thought behind this is if we actually involuntarily produce a shakeout, right, an involuntary shaking, that should keep us or have some kind of prevention towards becoming traumatized, right? And there is a disconnect from the body. So that's going in, releasing that trauma from the body and being able to regulate it. And I think that you make a great point with saying that that would be connected.
Yeah, it's just I think like it's sort of beautiful, again, this idea that we are we are kind of animals, and that we have, again, our bodies and our minds have the ability, and maybe we've lost that somewhere along the way and we have to get back to it. But also maybe that it just means we need each other, like animals can kind of shake it off, and they, that works for them and they don't get traumatized the way we do. But I think in our world, we've become so isolated, and so there's this idea for me that maybe while our bodies and brains can work on healing themselves, it also means we need each other to heal too. We have to have that community and that co-regulation.
Sure. And co-regulation is a big part of it,
Yeah.
right? Even when you're sitting in therapy, just the calm presence where you're relaxing your body, completely relaxing your body provides that response in someone else. Just think about when you're sitting next to someone who's like really anxious, you start feeling it in your body too.
Right. Absolutely.
And likewise, when a parent is calming a child, if they're, reacting like erratically, the child is going to feel that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. As a parent, I know that for sure. Right. Like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I find that my kids respond the best, of course, when my daughter is like having a tantrum and I just come over to her and I'm like, it's okay. And I maintain that kind of very loose, limp body position. She responds a lot more calmly, a lot more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Um, so I'm curious then for you, like, because we had talked about at the start, this idea of bringing ourselves into the therapy space, or having those experiences that led you to the work that you do, right? And so how do you keep regulated? What are the things that you do when you're in your work, when you're in the clinical space of, okay, like I'm going to take care of myself and keep myself regulated? Are there things that you focus on specifically so that you can be that co-regulation for your clients?
Absolutely. Eating and sleeping are two of the biggest ones for me, right? I think a lot of what I do and is I've kind of talked about a little bit, it's autonomic nervous system regulation. And even when I'm sitting with a client, I'm making sure to be able to provide that regulation in my body, right? So I don't, it's a job where we're feeling reactive and we care about what's going on with our clients. So it's important to keep ourselves regulated through that. I definitely meditate a lot.
Okay, nice.
Say that, but it's really just a very wonderful experience and very relaxing. Walking, journaling, and spending time with my kids brings me kind of back to balance.
Yeah, and I think that's so important as people who are in this space that it's kind of this weird, what am I trying to say? Not double-edged sword, but it just is like, it's a weird thing that we have to kind of work on balancing really intentionally. Of so much of what we do is not about us, right? In the working space, it's about our client, and yet we're bringing ourselves. So when we're not in the working space, we really have to prioritize ourselves. And so it can be work just in that aspect to make that a part of our job. Like, a part of my job is making sure I can co-regulate.
Yep. 100%. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of therapists, like even some of the clinicians in my group practice, they have trouble stopping. And guys, it's so important that you take care of yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And it's really a unique job in that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's about people working. They can work on the computer, they could talk on the phone, they can eat, they can play music. We are in there fully present for the full 45 minutes, right? So it's about how you're also scheduling. Are you scheduling back to back? How can you make breaks and create breaks for yourself so that you can continue to give all of you and fully?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad that you said it's a unique experience in that way, because um I mean, I'm sure that other professions who deal with, and help, medical professionals, things like that, they're also giving of themselves. And so it's not to say that we're the only people that experience something like this, but I do think it's very rare to have work where you have to be present, fully present, with one or a few people, both in your heart and, or all in your heart, mind, body,
Right.
all of it,
Right.
in that way for that extended period of time.
Oh, definitely.
And so I think it is hard for even people who are in mental health advocacy, who don't do the work, to sort of recognize, okay, this goes beyond saying like mental health matters, we need to, go to therapy, those kinds of things. Like, we have to take care of the people, the professionals that we're sending people to,
100%.
and this is one of my sort of soapboxes is, sure, yeah, advocate for therapy. Let's make mental health accessible. Mental health care, I mean, let's make it normal. Let's make it a priority, in the same way that we prioritize a lot of other things in our society. But if we're going to do that, we have to take care of the people that are doing this work, because you're not going to have therapists left to do what you're advocating for if you don't. And I don't know, everybody has a different experience, but I know when I first started out in this field, like, that was not my experience. Like, I was loaded down with work. I wasn't given the opportunity to take breaks. Self-care was sort of, it was a verbalized thing, but were we ever really given the opportunity to do it, like, in a real way?
Right.
Right. And I think that's a lot of people's experience, especially as like a young professional, a young clinician, and so I think there really has to be like a full revamp of a lot of the ways that the mental health system operates.
I think it's continuing education course, like requirements, self-care, self-care, self-care.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I agree.
And it's tricky because obviously it's a systemic issue, and we can't, one person, like, I can't fix that, you can't fix that, and but we could all work together to push that change forward. And so I think even just by like being a clinician who owns a practice with other clinicians in a group, and you are prioritizing that, and you're saying it's okay to need that, it's okay to slow down, it's okay to take care of yourself in that way, that's actually a big deal, because not a lot of practices operate that way right now. Yeah. So good for you. Good for you, as I guess
have to.
like, kudos.
Right, you have to. There'll be no therapist left to give, right? We have to take care of ourselves. And you made a great point about being mentally and physically all and emotionally present. it can be taxing for 45 minutes and 45 minutes. It's a lot of concentration for a human being. And that's why that self-care is so important. I wish everyone would integrate that a little more into their work.
Yeah, me too. I mean, and that's part of our goal ultimately. The clinical practice I work and through the academy is to make this work more sustainable for our clinicians, especially our trauma clinicians. And not to say that clinicians who don't work primarily with trauma experience those things too, but I think like in that co-regulation, in the same way we can give, I mean, we know this vicarious trauma is a real thing, but like in that co-regulation, as much as we can give that calming presence, to your point earlier, we can kind of take that on the other way, right? And so in trauma work, I think it's especially like thinking about that mind-body connection in trauma work is not just a suggestion anymore, it's a necessity. I don't know how we do trauma work without it anymore. Even not just like, again, not like an academic sense of, I understand that this is how this works and let me explain it to you, but like on a deep personal level.
Totally.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Is that something that you found challenging in the past at all when you've been working with clients, just kind of like, especially having your own trauma history and like kind of taking on these stories and holding space for these stories?
Well, yeah, actually more so in the beginning, even before I became certified.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of clients with trauma or PTSD, and some of the stories were really, I mean, really they go to your heart. They're heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching. So that was a bit of a challenge. But even now, it can happen, right? Somebody can come in and share something and your heart just breaks. But I think at this point, there's been so much training there that you kind of learn to kind of shelf it,
Yeah.
right? Because you have to, or you're not able to be present for your client.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think with time and experience and training, certainly that gets easier. But I think also it speaks to your humanity again, of like there's still stories, there's still human stories that get to that heart, no matter what the training is, right? And so it's just an ongoing process of recognizing that in ourselves.
I've had to stop myself from crying in sessions, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To you, have you ever been there?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And actually, we were that's so interesting that you bring that up, because I was having a conversation with someone else the other day about crying in session with clients. And, I've definitely had to stop myself from crying. And then on the other hand, I'm curious your thoughts on this, because I think this is sort of like a controversial topic among therapists, and I don't think there's like really a right answer. I think it probably depends on the situation, as our favorite thing to say is it depends. But sometimes I think that can also be validating for clients, is like when there are some tears, and maybe not like we're boo-hooing and, like now they're taking care of us, but just kind of like in that co-regulation idea of like letting the tears come and validating that from like a physiological standpoint. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the key word that you said there, and a big one, is depends, because I think some
Mm-hmm.
clients would totally appreciate that. And then there are other clients with more than just trauma that might find that offensive, or you're making the session about you, because I've had it go both ways in different times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think that's where the art comes in, right? Like everybody wants there to be a formula, and there's just not.
Like a parenting book, right? There's no formula for that either.
Yep, absolutely. If there was, there would be one book, and that would be it, and we'd be done, right? Right.
Totally.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so as we're talking about some of these different experiences, has there been an experience or maybe a set of experiences or that sort of changed the way that you have practiced over the years, like from starting out to now?
I would say COVID was a big one. And I'm sure,
Mm,
right? I had an in-person practice before that. 2020 came, everything shut down, and I went online. became totally virtual and remote. And I found that a lot of clients love that. There were still a few that prefer traditional face-to-face therapy, but they're like, this is so convenient. I love being able to do this from my car or my house, and I don't have to go anywhere, right? What's nice for me is whereas before I just had access to people on Staten Island, which is where I live and where my practice was, now I could see people all over New York and New York State who wouldn't otherwise have come or drive all the way down here. So I think that's definitely the biggest change that changed how I practice. And then getting certified in EMDR completely changed how I practice because it gives you such a wonderful roadmap and it is such an effective technique that now, by the way, treats a lot more than just trauma. It can literally be applied to anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm glad that you said that, because I think that people who have not experienced EMDR, who don't have that training, often do kind of just box it into, this is a trauma modality, which of course it is, but also, yeah, like I am not trained in it myself, but I've undergone it. And then I think you do brain spotting as well, which is similar. That's what I do. And so it goes so beyond trauma. it's useful for so many things. And I find myself with clients being like, oh, we could use it for this, we could use it for that. Like, let's bring it in. And sometimes that can freak people out because they're like, isn't that like a trauma thing? And I'm like, yeah, it is, but so much more. So I'm glad that you said that it can be used for all kinds of things.
Totally. And that's what I love about it because it could apply to so many things and can help so many people.
Yeah. And that's where that's a mind body, a somatic sort of modality in many ways as well, right? So there's so much co-regulation, I would imagine, as an EMDR practitioner. I'm not one, but like, again, just being in the room, being in the space, like co-regulation through the body as you're going through those protocols. Do you find that you notice that going on? It's not just about the movement and reprocessing.
Absolutely, especially when we do the butterfly tap, because it's not always like we either, move left to right or side to side, but sometimes we do butterfly taps. And when we do butterfly taps, the therapist is able to sit and do it with the clinicians who are doing it at the same time and at the same pace.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
Yeah. So for our listeners, if you're not watching on the video, Masha's describing butterfly tap. And if you're not familiar with it, Masha, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing?
Yes. So we're crossing one thumb into another and kind of creating a butterfly, and then we're tapping one hand at a time, and we're alternating hands, which is engaging the brain in bilateral stimulation to reprocess the way a memory affects you. Right?
Yeah.
If we're looking at it through the lens of trauma, really, what ends up happening is that our memories get stuck in part of our hippocampus and aren't being processed. When we see a flashback, we think it's illness, but it's actually wellness because the brain is trying to integrate it back where it belongs. And EMDR does that, which is fabulous, through the use of, tapping on both sides of your body, whether it's this way or it's through your eyes. The goal is that that memory will be refiltered and reprocessed in a more appropriate and healthy way.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that way that you described it. Instead of it's not illness, it's wellness, because our brain is working on reprocess or trying its best to untangle all of that and put it where it's supposed to be.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm curious, you talked about COVID and sort of changing how you practice as far as like the telehealth piece. And I'm curious if you noticed any shifts or changes in the co-regulation through like the computer screen versus in the physical space, because I've kind of heard both ways. Like I've heard some folks talk about how, it was so different. Like my clients really had a hard time like connecting, or like I even like saw some literature about how cutting off the body at where a computer screen would cut off makes it really difficult at times for clients to connect because their brain can't see the whole body. And then I've heard other folks say, no, it really hasn't made a big difference to me. And I can even sometimes my mirror neurons are like working through the computer screen. Like I can be very attuned um, virtually as well. And so I'm curious about how your experience has been with that.
So there are definitely people who prefer the face-to-face interaction, but I found that energy kind of transcends space and time. And you can really, really feel somebody's energy and see what they're doing, whether it's, a lot of what I'm looking for is in the facial expression. Right.
Mhm.
And what I think is important is sometimes if I'm feeling like I need to connect with that more, I'll have the client move back a bit and then I can see their body or, we'll do a lot of body scans. So I know what's going on somatically. Anyway, so I found
Mm,
that it actually benefited my practice personally, but I can see how there can be pros and cons.
for sure. Yeah. No, I just appreciate your perspective. I like hearing from different people who have had different experiences with this, because we've all sort of, I think, been, unless you were doing a lot of telehealth before, which most of us were not in the same way that we are now. We've sort of been navigating this into the unknown a little bit, right? And so I love hearing people's perspectives on that, especially when we do mind body focused work, because I think there was a lot of fear around that at the start of, what is this going to feel like? What is this going to be like? And I agree. As far as like looking at facial expressions, we can still like see those micro changes in people's countenance, when we are really present, and we can still feel that energy. And I totally agree that it can transcend that time and space barrier. But I love the idea of like incorporating the body scan, so you're still like mindful and making it a purposeful awareness of the whole body, so the client doesn't get cut off into that, right? So yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. Mm-hmm. So are there any other integrative tools that you find complement? We've talked about EMDR, we've talked about that co-regulation. Any other tools that you find complement this work really well for you?
So if sometimes someone comes in, they have an individual trauma, we'll do a trauma narrative, which is really cool. And, we'll just have the client write from start to finish with as much visual detail as possible what happened, which also actually works perfectly flashbacks and nightmares only. Because again, it's that integration of putting the memory where it belongs, which can be really, really effective. I do EFT tapping,
Mhm.
which is amazing. I like it because there's a SUD scale, so you can assess how anxious are you right now, right? And we can keep assessing that. So I think those are wonderful. Definitely a lot of somatic work where I'll have the client feel into what's going on. So if a client's saying, "Oh, I'm feeling, tension in my chest," I'll ask them to feel into it and to feel into it fully. And then I'll expand into NLP techniques of kind of changing the color, the shape, and the size of the paint. And I love that. I find that it's super effective. My clients love it, right? Because the subconscious mind can't really tell what's real and what's not. It can't tell that something's not happening right now. It's the blind mind.
Right. Yeah.
So I think those are some of my favorite things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Brain spotting, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love brain spotting, and I love that idea of using, and I think in my brain spotting work, we use that suds, and then we also have some of that languaging, or can have that languaging around like changing the color and the shape, and sort of like using these, you know, what might be considered sort of like non-traditional ways of describing feeling,
Yeah.
even though they're very natural once you get into it, right? Because feeling it goes beyond language. Um, is so beneficial. And I really love that idea. My background actually, I don't know if I've ever shared this with our listeners, but my background is in art therapy as well. And so I think very visually a lot anyway. And so there's so much research around how when, this, when we process traumatic memory, very often we're processing it with a more primitive part of our brain, and so we don't have language. It really is more of like a sensorium, sort of a abstract experience that the feeling is. So going into those ideas of like using color, using texture, using sound and smell and all of those senses before we're trying to label the feeling with a word like sad or happy. That can be incredibly healing and effective. And then using those like those words to change that shape and that texture. I mean, that can make a huge difference for people, I have found.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. So I love that. I think that totally. Do you use that with the EMDR work that you do as well?
I actually do. I combine a lot. A lot of times when I see a client's getting stuck, or we'll do a body scan and they can't move past the feeling in their body. And after we explore what that means, we'll go ahead and we'll do that. And most of the time dissipates. I've had one client who it just wouldn't go away for, but that was fear of letting go of the trauma. But most of the time it's quite effective.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like, I'm glad you said that too. Like, it can be layered, right? So there can be fear of letting go of this trauma. And that's like fear upon, we have to work down through the layers. It's often so much more complex. Like, sometimes we do have those individual incidents that we can process through, but usually it's much more layered than that. So, yeah, absolutely. What should I ask about that I haven't asked about yet? What should I know about your work and what you're excited about and what you do, maybe that I haven't gotten into yet?
Well, besides for trauma, and I know you shared a little bit about this in the bio, I also specialize in anxiety, OCD, perinatal disorders, narcissistic abuse recovery, and I'm pretty passionate about all of them. And
Mhm.
that gets treated differently depending on what someone's coming with.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, and I would imagine there's a lot of crossover in those things too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you find, or is there anything that you find crosses over a lot these days for folks that you work with?
I think a little bit, I think self-esteem, women and hormone and unsupportive partners or partners who don't understand what they're going through or don't believe them, or just say, hey, this is just a woman's thing, you're overly emotional, you're crazy, whatever the nonsense is. And I find that happening so much in my practice. So I'm very passionate about that. And helping, sometimes I work with couples to help them understand, like, this is a hormonal process. This is not something that somebody's inventing, or if it's trauma, this is a biological process. This is a real thing, right?
Mhm.
So I think that can get upsetting. Like, I have some men that get upset at their wives for not being as present, but they're like trying to survive, literally,
Yeah.
right? Because it's an invisible illness. No one sees it. And they think, hey, it's just in your head. It's just in your head. Well, guess what? Your brain is an organ, just like it would be in, your heart or anything else.
Right. Absolutely. Oh, I'm so glad you're speaking to that, because I personally have had two kids, and in the perinatal sort of experience is unlike anything that I've ever like gone through in my life, honestly. And so I think it is hard as a person who, maybe a partner who hasn't gone through that or is not going through that, to conceptualize what that really feels like. And so I would imagine being that bridge, you talked about in the couples work, is incredibly powerful, just to have someone else say, let's talk about how real this really is.
Mhm.
I can only imagine that's like incredibly validating and helpful.
Absolutely. And I would say, besides trauma, that's a really big passion for me, is to make men more understanding of women's issues, that they are real, even if you don't experience them. And some men are fabulous and completely supportive, right? And ideally, those that's great. But you have the ones, and you have women sometimes that are unsupportive of women's, and not just men, because if they haven't been through it, they're like, oh, stop making things up. You're lazy. You're this. I've had someone tell me I was lazy and I invented the whole thing.
Oh
Yeah,
my goodness. Oh my gosh.
I,
Ah,
I know.
whew, that gives me chills. I like can't. It's so
I do not.
frustrating.
Totally. When I went to the doctor a while ago and I said, hey, look, I have postpartum depression. He's like, that's not true. You look nice. You don't have postpartum depression.
Oh
The
my
ignorance is
goodness.
mind blowing.
I mean, and see, here's where I start to feel the frustration rise. Like, and of course, you're right. Like, there's a long history of women and AFAB people's pain being minimized.
Exactly.
And
Area, right?
yeah,
Freudian.
absolutely. Yeah, in the medical field, but it's just sometimes I continue to be surprised by it somehow.
Oh, right? You would think you're not shocked anymore, but it still shocks you. It still finds a way.
Uh-huh. It does. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm so glad that you're passionate about it, because I think we need more folks to be passionate about it and to validate experiences, because I think it can be incredibly isolating. Um, you have this background where you knew in that moment when the doctor said that to you, there was a part of you, even if it wasn't your whole self, there was a part of you that was like, this is not right.
Absolutely.
Like there's something wrong here with what you're saying to me. But I think so many people, they don't have that knowledge or that background to even question. They're just like, this is a medical professional. They're telling me I'm fine. And so I think having people who not only have had the experience, but also like have the knowledge to say like, no, like this is a medical professional, but they're not right. They're and not all doctors are like that. Some doctors are incredibly knowledgeable and validating and understanding, but because of that history of having all of this invalidation, I think it can be very isolating. And then we just think, well, this is my experience. Nobody else has this experience. I am, to your like words, I'm crazy. There's something wrong with me.
That's me about that. Even like someone like me, you're right. I probably did have the experience to know that that is not the correct thing to say to somebody going through that. But yet I was so embarrassed and so ashamed that I was even going through it. And he was like, I'm like, do you have other women in the practice? He's like, no, you're the only one. I swear. Right. So I was like, okay, so you already feel kind of, and maybe that was the truth. And thank God, hopefully nobody else was suffering, but like you already feel so isolated and strange and guilty. And being in that very, very unsupportive environment, from your partner to the doctor around you to whoever, you really just feel like completely nuts,
Yeah.
for lack of a word. And you're the opposite from being nuts when you're going through something. You're very in touch with reality.
Oh, yes. Yep.
A little too much in touch with
Yes.
reality. Everything sets you off the edge and you're hyper vigilant. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Absolutely. You
you
are
feel
very
it.
in touch with reality in that moment. I'm so glad you said that too, because that hits for me. I'm sure that hits for so many people listening. Just to have that validation of, no, it's the absolute opposite. Like, this is as real as it gets. Your
Exactly.
experience is as real as it gets. You
And
are.
it's comforting to hear that when you're in that kind of situation. I
Oh,
had
man.
someone say to me at the time, a therapist, she was like, I believe you. And I promise we're going to get through this. And you're not crazy. And I hate that word, but she
Yeah.
was like, you're okay. You know what you're going through is very real. And it was, I think I cried for hours after having somebody show up for me in that way.
Yeah. Oh, I would imagine, because even hearing you say that, like, cognitively in my mind, like having heard that before and knowing that that's true, just hearing you say that in this moment as we're talking, like I feel that in my body, how validating, how like, I just get like full body chills, like how, what a difference that makes to hear it
Totally. And look,
in a moment.
say we're co-regulating now.
Yeah, absolutely. We are. And it's huge, because I think also as people who have children, as mothers, as parents, again, to this idea of isolation, like we are so isolated just in parenthood. Um, and so having that even one person who can do what they did for you in that moment that therapist did for you is to co-regulate and say like, man, like you are not supposed to be alone. And so now you're not, we're in this together.
So
Right?
nice.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it's really interesting because I don't know if you have found this, but I have found that like since I have moved into this parenthood phase of my life, I have like gotten more clients who have also been in that life space, and not even necessarily intentionally. It's just like we like find each other. We like draw our being together like to each other. I don't know if you have found anything like that, but
So much.
it's fascinating to me. Yeah.
I'm getting all of those women that I was talking about that have those unsupportive partners that aren't seeing what's really going on for what's going on and are experiencing in that same state of life. So
Yeah. And I think that is so just mysterious and fascinating and beautiful to me, that like to your point about energy, like connecting across time and space, it's like somehow our energy is like moving in this like connected web of humanity, that we are like pulling these people to like, it's not just like, oh, you need me, it's like I need you to, our experiences are connecting.
it's like attracts like.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's just like such a beautiful example, like one beautiful example of the way that we can use our humanity to bring healing for each other, and how we bring our whole selves into this work always. Like whether it's trauma work or our perinatal issues, or working with partners or whatever, like we cannot not bring ourselves and our humanity into the work. So thank you for doing that work and like bringing your humanity into it as well. Absolutely. Yeah. So as we're kind of starting to wind down, we ask all of our guests to share if you have anything that is relevant for you, like a practice, any kind of a tool that can kind of give our listeners and us a taste of the work that you do like in real time.
Sure. So since we spent a lot of time talking about co-regulation, I think it would be good to show you guys how we're trained to do it from a traumatic perspective. And just to give a small background on it, the reason this is effective is because when we're over adapted to stress, as we are every day, or if we have trauma, the amygdala, right, which is the part of our brain that's all fear and worry, releases a ton of adrenaline, pumps that into our blood, which involuntarily tightens our muscles, right? When this happens, the neocortex, it's that part of your brain that lets you think clearly and logically, when you're nervous versus when you're not, shuts off. So it can respond to the false sense of danger that's there, right? So when this happens, those muscles get super tight. And in order to send biofeedback back to our brains, right, to turn the amygdala off and turn the neocortex back on, we want to go limp in our body. Right. And the way we do this is you can do it in one of two ways. One, you can squeeze all of your muscles simultaneously for 5, right? And then fully release for 5. And you should notice just a change in your state, right? Did that feel good, Laurel?
Absolutely. Oh, it feels so good. I love that. That's like, it gives me like the warm gooeys. Like, like yeah.
For me, an easier way for me is I kind of push my shoulders down into my chest cavity. Like I imagine it opening, and you can do that the more you get used to it. Like a lot of clients will be like, well, do I have to stand or do I have to sit for this? I'm like, no, like the more you do it, and they say the more you do it, the better. It literally, reshapes your nervous system. Right.
Yeah.
Over and over again, the easier it will be for you to get into that state. And another kind of quick way to do this is they say to do a Kegel, which is a squeeze in like the muscle that would otherwise hold your urine really, really tightly for 5 and then release for 5. And in the trauma training, they said that this is a very quick shortcut to parasympathetic activity. Switching.
So it's like a pelvic floor connection.
Yes.
Love that. Yeah.
That
is so interesting.
It's really cool. They like drew out how that little square, like around that area, links right to your parasympathetic nervous system. And you can feel it just.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm glad that you are sharing that because, first of all, as a person who's a woman, like, I mean, I've heard of Kegels before, but never really in connection with trauma, right?
I
Like
know.
we hear about it for other things,
I know.
but also because there are plenty of listeners who are not women, who don't have female sex bodies, whose pelvic floor is ignored so much. And I think like that can be a valuable tool for them as well. And they just probably have never been told about even what that is, So I'm so glad you shared that as a tool.
Thank you. I was surprised to learn that too, that was one of the ways is through a pelvic floor exercise. I was like, wow.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you for those tips. I'm going to be like pushing my shoulders down into my chest cavity all day. It does feel really good.
Good. I'm glad you liked it. And I hope
Yeah.
everybody's helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'm just so grateful for you and for our conversation and for this time today, Masha. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience. And yeah, I'm curious if people are interested in the work you're doing. Where can they find you? Do you have any links we can put in our show notes or anything like that?
So my website is www.werisenyc.com. I think that's the easiest way. We have an Instagram, but we're not too active on it.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Well, we'll definitely put the website in. So if folks want to connect with you through your practice, they can. And just thank you again so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll talk soon.